Number 16. The attempted kidnapping of a British princess. Queen Elizabeth's only daughter, 23-year-old Princess Anne, and her husband Philip were on their way back to Buckingham Palace after a charity film screening on the night of March 20th, 1974. But before they made it back to the palace, a white Ford Escort forced their limousine to stop in the road. It happened just 200 yards from their destination, but it was far enough away for the driver of the Ford to confront the royal party with 2 handguns without being noticed by palace security. Riding in the limousine with the couple was 31-year-old Inspector James Wallace Beaton. He got out of the car to confront the Ford driver, who was later described by Smithsonian Magazine as a bearded man with light red hair named Ian Ball. Inspector Beaton assumed the man was a disgruntled driver, but he never got a chance to find out before a bullet struck him in the shoulder. Beaton was the only member of SO14, the Scotland Yard branch tasked with protecting royalty, and he'd been assigned to act as Princess Anne's security that night. He was armed and tried to shoot Ball, but his gun jammed after firing once. 26-year-old Ball had meticulously planned to kidnap Anne, renting a car under a fake name and bringing along with him 2 pairs of handcuffs. He also packed Valium tranquilizers and wrote a ransom letter addressed to the Queen, demanding £2 million, ransom to be delivered in £5 sterling notes. After shooting Beaton, Ball pulled repeatedly on the limousine door handle while Anne and Philip fought to keep the door shut. Meanwhile, Anne's lady-in-waiting crawled out of the car on the opposite side. Beaton then jumped back in and inserted himself between the couple and the aggressor as Ball shot into the car. As Beaton fell out of the vehicle and onto the ground from multiple gunshot wounds, chauffeur Alexander Callender confronted Ball. The gunman shot him in the chest, then opened the car door and grabbed Anne's wrist while Philip held onto her waist. As the men fought over Anne, she told Ball she didn't want to go with him, taking a more irritated than scared tone. But Ball refused to back down. He shot responding police constable Michael Hills, who radioed for backup as he collapsed to the ground. Several civilians intervened, including a 6'4" cleaning executive and former boxer named Ronald Russell, who approached the scene on foot. And a driver named Glenmore Martin also tried to stop the kidnapping attempt by blocking Ball's car with his vehicle in order to prevent Ball from fleeing the scene. Daily Mail journalist John Bryan McConnell also confronted Ball and was shot. Russell, the former boxer, struck Ball in the back of the head. A struggle ensued as Ball attempted to keep his control over Anne, but Russell repeatedly punched him. Finally, as numerous police officers looked on, Ball fled the scene on foot. He was quickly captured and eventually pleaded guilty to kidnapping and attempted murder, and for his senseless actions, the court sentenced him to life in a mental asylum. Number 15. Homeowner fights back against felonious foursome. Early one morning in May of 2022, a homeowner in Auburn, Indiana, awoke to his dog barking and encountered 4 intruders who were attempting to carry out a burglary. One of the suspects pointed a gun at the victim, while 2 others stole various items. They also ordered the homeowner to write them a check. But as soon as the opportunity presented itself, the homeowner grabbed his shotgun and fatally shot 2 of the suspects, who were later identified as 36-year-old Rameka LaSharon Moore and 22-year-old Dylan Scott Moorfield. He forced the 3rd robber outside at gunpoint, where he found a 4th suspect waiting in a getaway car, whom he ordered to call 911. The getaway driver complied, and emergency responders were dispatched to the scene. The surviving suspects, 42-year-old Tabitha L. Johnson and 42-year-old Sean T. Cruz of Fort Wayne, were taken into custody on suspicion of felony burglary and murder. Although neither of them fired the shots that killed their co-conspirators, Indiana law allowed for them to be held responsible for their accomplices' deaths. While researching the suspects' backgrounds, local station WANE 15 discovered that all 4 of the alleged burglars had criminal histories. Records showed that Tabitha Johnson had multiple prior misdemeanor convictions, with the most recent being for 1 count of possession of a narcotic resulting from a plea deal she took in 2021. Her crime stretched as far back as 2000, when she was convicted of non-support of a dependent child. Sean Cruz had at least 3 felonies under his belt, including a 2014 forgery conviction, as well as theft convictions from 2009 and 2012. Authorities deemed the shooting justified under Indiana's Stand Your Ground law and declined to press criminal charges against the homeowner. During the investigation, detectives learned that Johnson had stayed with the homeowner on and off for roughly a decade. It's believed that she told her co-conspirators about possible valuables that might be in the home, and as it turned out, the four suspects had gone to the residence the day before the intrusion and had pressured the homeowner to give them money. But when their request for cash was denied, they returned early the next morning and took a more forceful approach. Johnson pleaded guilty to one count of burglary in exchange for having the murder charge dropped. She received a 14-year prison sentence for her role in the botched robbery. Cruz also took a plea deal and admitted to one count of assisting in burglary, and in exchange for his cooperation, the other charges were dropped. The prosecution recommended a 4-year sentence with only 2 to be served in prison, and he also urged the judge to require Cruz to undergo drug rehab. Cruz is scheduled to be sentenced on June 12, 2013. Number 14. Tennessee homeowner defends teenage son. A Murfreesboro, Tennessee homeowner was at his house with his teenage son and his dog when 2 masked intruders broke in at around 8:30 p.m. one day in May 2023. The burglars used a taser on the dog and held the teenager at gunpoint, but luckily the homeowner had enough time to retrieve his gun. He fired his weapon in self-defense and fatally shot 52-year-old Kevin Ford, who was pronounced dead at the scene by emergency responders. The second suspect, later identified as 42-year-old Clifford Wright, fled the scene and was later found at a local Salvation Army shelter, suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. But he was taken to a hospital for treatment and survived his injuries. Wright faces charges of aggravated burglary, attempted aggravated robbery, being a convicted felon in possession of a firearm, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a violent felony. Speaking anonymously with local station WTVF, the homeowner said he heard his dog barking as if he was in pain. But once he realized what was going on, he said that he knew it was either them or me and my family, and he wasn't about to let it be the latter. He also said that he wished the situation hadn't played out the way it did, but that he was glad the outcome was in his favor. Under Tennessee law, a homeowner can shoot an intruder when they believe that the use of force is necessary to prevent or terminate the other's trespass on the land or unlawful interference with the property. Consequently, authorities declined to charge the man who shot the intruders in defense of his property, himself, and his loved ones. Wright remains behind bars at the Rutherford County Adult Detention Center on $700,000 bail while he awaits his next court date. Number 13. Club goer stops mass shooter. In a horrifying scenario that's becoming all too common in the United States, an armed shooter entered a gay nightclub in Colorado Springs on the night of November 19, 2022. The suspect then opened fire on a dance party with an AR-15 assault rifle. Wearing body armor and carrying multiple magazines filled with ammunition, the shooter, later identified as 22-year-old Anderson Lee Aldrich, began indiscriminately spraying bullets at both customers and employees at Club Q. Many patrons initially mistook the gunfire for music, but they quickly realized what was happening when the sound of the shots continued and they saw muzzle flashes. Hoping to escape the gunfire, people rushed behind the bar and into dressing rooms for cover, while others stayed low to the ground. Several minutes into the shooting, a U.S. Army veteran named Richard M. Fierro charged across the room and took Aldrich to the ground, causing him to drop his gun on his way to the floor. Fierro then grabbed a rifle and repeatedly struck Aldrich in the head with it. Holding Aldrich down, however, was no easy task. At an estimated 300 pounds, the shooter wasn't a small guy, but Fierro managed to keep him subdued with the help of fellow patron Thomas James, who took the gun and kept it out of Aldrich's reach, and a trans woman who stomped on the suspect with her heels while they waited for police to arrive. 5 people died in the gunfire, while 19 others were injured, but authorities believe that number would have been much higher if it weren't for Fierro and the 2 other civilian bystanders who bravely intervened. Aldrich remains in custody while facing 305 criminal counts, including 5 counts of murder and 5 counts of committing a bias-motivated crime causing bodily injury. He reportedly has a criminal record, as well as a troubling history of facilitating hate speech on a website he created. But the judge overseeing his current case has ordered for his record to be sealed due to the potential for his past to affect the ongoing case. Number 12. Good Samaritans thwart kidnapping in progress. On what began as a typical Friday morning on June 2, 2023, a man allegedly showed up at the Plymouth, Massachusetts home of his estranged wife, despite the victim having an order of protection in place against him. He's accused of abducting the woman by grabbing her head and neck and pulling her as she clung to one of her children. The victim's screaming got the attention of neighbor and former corrections officer Jamie Costa, who tackled the suspect, and as the kidnapper reached for what appeared to be a gun in his waistband, 2 brothers who were working nearby, Jeffrey Williams and David Williams, rushed over to the scene. One of the brothers helped Costa tackle the alleged kidnapper, while the other brother pulled his own gun on the suspect. The trio then held the suspect down until Officer Bobby Hackett arrived on scene in response to a call about a man with a gun chasing a woman. Costa later told NBC Boston that he stopped at his home to grab some things when he overheard an altercation taking place across the street. He said that he knew it was serious when he saw the victim struggling against her captor as he dragged her uphill. Without thinking twice, he sprang into action. Until the Williams brothers arrived, Costa fought to keep the suspect from accessing the gun that he appeared to be reaching for. The Williams brother, who pulled his own gun on the abductor, apparently issued a verbal warning that he was armed and that things were going to get ugly if the man continued to fight. Authorities charged the 39-year-old suspect with violation of a restraining order, assault and battery on a family member, kidnapping, assault with a dangerous weapon, and reckless endangerment of a child. Responding officers also found a face mask and handcuffs in his possession. Plymouth police credited Costa and the Williams brothers with saving the victim's life. Speaking with NBC Boston, Costa said he intervened without hesitation and that he hopes others do the same if they ever see a situation like that going on. And it wasn't the first time he was commended for his bravery. Back in 2019, Costa received a reward for tackling a man as he fled from police. Number 11. Pregnant wife saves the day. A Florida woman named Casey Johns sprang into action despite being 8 months pregnant when she found her husband, Jeremy King, being beaten, kicked, and pistol-whipped by 2 armed intruders in 2019. It was at the couple's home in Lithia, roughly 25 miles from Tampa, at around 9 p.m. when the suspects barged in and demanded money at gunpoint. Each intruder was armed with a handgun, and one of them fired a shot while inside the home. But when she saw what was happening, Johns grabbed the family's AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and fired a single shot, striking one of the suspects. And according to police, the gun was legally owned. The suspects fled on foot, but the one who got shot didn't make it very far before he collapsed in a drainage ditch and died. Authorities identified the deceased intruder as 27-year-old Joseph Michael Byers. Meanwhile, King was taken to the hospital with multiple injuries, including a fractured eye socket, a fractured sinus cavity, and a concussion. He received 20 stitches and 3 staples to the head, but it could have been much worse. In fact, King told Bay News 9 that if it wasn't for his wife stepping in, he might have been killed. Following an investigation, authorities charged Byers' alleged accomplice, 19-year-old Tyze Robinson, with felony murder. And although King's wife fired the fatal shot, investigators determined that the shooting was justified from the homeowner's standpoint and that Robinson could be held accountable for his co-conspirator's death. They also charged the suspected getaway driver, 24-year-old Kiara Rajans, with accessory to felony murder. King said that neither he nor his wife knew their attackers, but it appeared as though the suspect specifically targeted the family, according to Major Frank Lossett from the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, who spoke with reporters on the scene. Moreover, law enforcement believed that the Kings were targeted because of criminal activity that was allegedly going on in the home at the time of the crime. Consequently, Child Protective Services concluded that the couple's children were in an unsafe environment and removed them from the home, leaving Jeremy King both appalled and dumbfounded, as he put it. Speaking with Bay 9 News, King adamantly denied any ongoing criminal activity at his home, despite having a marijuana possession conviction on his record. And as if the case wasn't already complicated enough, in early 2020, authorities charged yet another suspect for their alleged involvement in the crime. 19-year-old Dalton Martin was at the King's home when the attempted robbery occurred, and the victims reportedly found it suspicious that he didn't take action to try stopping the crime in progress. According to investigators, this was because Martin knew about the home invasion ahead of time and was in on it. For his role in the crime, he was charged with second-degree felony murder with a firearm. Martin narrowly avoided prison time and was sentenced to 15 years of probation, while Tyze Robinson was acquitted by a jury. The outcome of the case for the third surviving suspect, Kiara Rajans, is unclear, and it's unknown whether King got his children back. Number 10. Elisha Dicken. There are few issues that Americans are more divided on than guns, especially as the United States remains plagued by record shootings in recent years. But it was hard to deny that it was a good thing 22-year-old Elisha Dicken had his gun on him when a mass shooter opened fire at a shopping mall in Indiana in 2022. The incident in question began in a food court at Greenwood Park Mall shortly before 6 p.m. on Sunday, July 17th. Dicken was shopping with his girlfriend at the time, and the mall was getting ready to close when gunshots echoed through the building. Less than 2 minutes after the shooting began, Dicken pulled his handgun and opened fire on the suspect, who tried fleeing into a nearby bathroom, but was fatally struck by the gunfire. 3 civilians lost their lives in the mass shooting, and 4 others were injured, but authorities believed those numbers would have been much higher if Dicken hadn't intervened. Investigators identified the shooter as a 20-year-old local resident with no criminal history named Jonathan Douglas Sapperman. He entered the mall with 3 guns and over 100 rounds of ammunition in his possession that day. But thanks to Dicken's response to the gunfire, he only managed to shoot 24 rounds before he was stopped. Sapperman was responsible for all 3 civilian deaths that occurred. Over a 5-year period starting in 2017, the suspect had made over 200 Reddit posts referencing mass shootings. And while none of his commentary suggested that he was actually planning on committing one, he seemed oddly fascinated with gun crimes and had a troubling fixation with Nazi Germany. In the months leading up to the shooting, Sapperman had quit his warehouse job and was facing eviction from his apartment. During a press conference the day after the shooting, Greenwood Police Chief Jim Eisen described Dicken's actions as nothing short of heroic, as well as proficient and tactically sound. He further explained how the quick-thinking civilian engaged the shooter from quite a distance as he moved in on the suspect while motioning for people to exit behind him. Authorities determined that Dicken was carrying his gun lawfully and that his decision to respond to the gunfire by shooting at Sapperman was justified. Dicken had no police or military training, but had been taught to shoot by his grandfather. Number 9. Relative rescues kidnapping victim. 29-year-old Bethany Arsenault experienced the terror of a lifetime when she was kidnapped by her ex-boyfriend and the father of her child, Scott Thomas, in Louisiana in 2013. Bethany had an order of protection against Thomas, which he'd violated at least once before he abducted her. But because they had a son together, they couldn't completely avoid interacting with one another. The kidnapping happened when Bethany went to pick up her son from Thomas after finishing her workday. According to a police interview, Thomas tried to hug Bethany while she stood outside his car. She rejected the affectionate advances and got into her car to leave, at which point Thomas reached into her vehicle and tried unbuckling their child from his car seat. Bethany sped away, only to have Thomas chase after her in his vehicle. The brief pursuit ended outside a daycare center, where witnesses saw the young woman running with her son in her arms and yelling at bystanders to dial 911. Horrified onlookers watched as Thomas shoved Bethany and the child into his vehicle and drove off with one hand on the steering wheel and another holding his ex-girlfriend by her hair. Bethany would later claim that she nearly escaped at least once, but nobody came to help when she screamed. 3 days of sheer terror followed as Thomas held her at knife point and repeatedly threatened to kill her while taking her to various hiding places. He abandoned his car in a rural area and forced Bethany to walk through the forest and a sugarcane field, making multiple stops before ending up at an abandoned house. And by then, Bethany was barefoot and her clothes were ripped. Left with no other choice, Bethany slept on a dirty mattress at knife point for the next several nights, using an old piece of carpet as a blanket. Thomas allowed her to call her sister before he took his phone apart, and the victim later described how her ex occasionally paced by the windows of the house while saying things like, "You should have just loved me," and "Why didn't you love me?" At various points throughout the harrowing ordeal, Bethany could hear law enforcement searching for her, but she was too afraid that her ex would kill her to try reaching help. Thomas repeatedly threatened to kill Bethany if the cops figured out where they were and descended upon the scene. And during one moment of desperation, Bethany tried to hit Thomas with a rod she found in the bathroom, but it was ineffective and only made him angrier. She also tried to escape through the bathroom window, but Thomas caught her and no longer allowed her to use the bathroom unsupervised. By the third morning, Thomas knew help was getting close, and he seemed more paranoid and nervous than ever. He then told Bethany that it was almost time for them to die. By the time Bethany's cousin, Marcus Arsenault, kicked down the door with over a dozen family members in tow, Thomas was cutting and stabbing her. Marcus wasted no time following the sound of Bethany's screams to a small bedroom, where he shot Thomas 11 times. Thankfully, Bethany survived her injuries, and authorities declined to prosecute Marcus Arsenault or any of the woman's other relatives for their role in Thomas's death. Some people claimed that the Arsenault family took action and barged into the abandoned house because the police refused to do so, although it's unclear if this is true. Number 8. Florida homeowner fires at burglars. A Florida man and his girlfriend were just coming inside at around 2 a.m. after a night out in 2023 when they encountered two strangers in the kitchen of their Haines City home. The homeowner drew his 9mm handgun, which he had a permit to carry, and fired 5 rounds at the suspect closest to him. He then fled the home with his girlfriend and their puppy and dialed 911 while driving to the police station. The couple met with law enforcement and were cooperative with the investigation right from the beginning. During a press conference, Haines City Police Chief Greg Gorick said that the homeowner immediately surrendered his gun and showed his concealed carry permit. And after hearing the victim's version of events, police decided that the shooting most likely qualified as a stand your ground case under Florida law. In other words, it appeared to be a justified case of self-defense. By the time responding officers arrived at the scene of the shooting, both suspects had fled, leaving behind 5 shell casings and a trail of blood leading outside. With help from a K9 unit, police found one of the suspects, 27-year-old Tyreek Washington, under a pavilion at a nearby park, where he was suffering from 4 gunshot wounds, 2 to the chest and 2 to the legs. But even though he was suspected of committing a serious felony, the cops weren't about to let him die. The 4 officers who were at the scene immediately took life-saving measures by applying a tourniquet and putting pressure on the wounds to stop the bleeding. And thanks to their diligent efforts, the man survived. He was then airlifted to the hospital, where he remained in critical but stable condition in the days following the shooting. Near the pavilion where the suspect was rescued, police found a ring belonging to the homeowner. Tyreek Washington faces charges of unarmed burglary of an occupied dwelling and grand theft, and according to the most recent available updates on the case, the second suspect was still at large. Tina Phillip, who identified herself as the homeowner's aunt, told ABC Action News that her nephew was shaken up by the ordeal. In fact, she described him as being a nervous wreck. But she was relieved that he was okay, considering how much worse the situation could have turned out. Number 7. Missouri woman escapes suspected serial killer. A 22-year-old African-American woman from Missouri endured weeks of torture at the hands of a kidnapper in 2022 after multiple community members had complained to the police about a suspected serial abductor. Multiple black women had reportedly gone missing from the area, so it made sense to think that they may have all been targeted by the same person. Yet local authorities allegedly wrote civilian concerns off as completely unfounded. The final victim, and the only one to actually survive their captivity, escaped from 39-year-old Timothy M. Hazlitt after being held in his basement and repeatedly assaulted over a month-long period. She saw her opportunity to break free after Hazlitt left to take his child to school one day. The woman sought help from a neighbor who called the police. Rose Crowley was babysitting her grandchild that morning when a woman showed up on the front porch. During an interview with local station KCTV, she recalled how the victim was shaking from head to toe as she pleaded for help. Crowley said that the woman was terrified that her captor was going to show up, and she remembers seeing duct tape and ligature marks on her neck and wrists. As they waited for police to arrive, Crowley brought the woman inside, put a blanket around her, and gave her some muffins and water. Responding officers arrived to find that the victim was also wearing a collar with a padlock, which they had to cut off, and latex lingerie, which Hazlitt allegedly forced the woman to wear. Crowley focused on comforting the woman while she told police about the prolonged horror she'd endured. Authorities launched a large-scale investigation into Hazlitt's past, which showed that he was a former railroad worker with no known criminal history besides several previous traffic infractions. In early 2023, he was indicted on a laundry list of charges, including 2 counts of second-degree assault, 4 counts of sodomy, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of endangering the welfare of a child. According to the most recent updates on the case, Hazlitt is being held on $3 million bond as his case continues to work its way through the court system. And although it remains unclear whether there are other victims, the investigation is ongoing. And while the brave woman who managed to escape didn't stop Hazlitt in a conventional sense, it's thanks to her quick thinking that the suspect is no longer able to harm innocent civilians. Number 6. Ansley Pacheco. OnlyFans star and Instagram model Ansley Pacheco was at her home in Hialeah, Florida with her son, her husband Daniel, and some friends one evening in 2020 when a pair of masked intruders barged in with Uzis and opened fire. The armed suspects got into the apartment by following a guest as he was arriving and pushing their way in as he entered. Harrowing surveillance footage captured the men shooting at Daniel and his friends while Ansley hurried to grab her own handgun. Dressed only in her underwear, she shot back at the burglars from her bedroom while yelling at them not to shoot because her son was in the room with her. The robbers blatantly ignored Ansley's warning though and fired at least 6 bullets in her direction. She and her son narrowly avoided the gunfire, which struck several pieces of furniture and a TV. Daniel chased the men out of the home, and thankfully nobody was hurt, but the thieves made off with over $100,000 worth of jewelry. Unfortunately, it appears as though the suspects were never caught. It's unclear whether Ansley's internet fame had anything to do with why the thieves targeted her, and both she and Daniel said they had no idea who might have been responsible for the burglary. Number 5. Tina Ring and Ashley Lee. While working at their family-owned liquor store in Tulsa, Oklahoma one Saturday in 2018, mother-daughter duo Tina Ring and Ashley Lee came face-to-face with an armed robber with a sawed-off shotgun. Later identified as 36-year-old Tyrone Lee, he held the women at gunpoint and ordered them to hand over the cash from the register. The pair complied, and as Tyrone walked away, they tried to activate the store's security system, which would have trapped the thief between 2 sets of front doors. But the interior door didn't lock fast enough, and the suspect was able to get back inside, leaving him and the victims trapped inside the store together. Lee allegedly pointed a gun at Tina and Ashley, who were hiding, but he was unaware that one of the women had her own handgun, and at that point she felt like she was in enough danger to justify pulling the trigger. The intruder tried escaping multiple times before finally succeeding. Luckily, though, authorities tracked Lee down after he showed up at a local hospital in critical condition from his bullet wounds. Once he was well enough to be placed behind bars, he was taken into custody on suspicion that he committed as many as 9 burglaries in the week leading up to the botched liquor store robbery. During an interview with local station KFOR, Tyrone Lee apologized for his actions. But it wasn't enough to spare him from the legal consequences of his crimes, and in the end, he was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Number 4. Trio robs the wrong house. In a shocking encounter that was captured on camera, 3 armed men could be seen kicking in the front door of a Gwinnett County, Georgia home at 4 a.m. one day in 2016. But they didn't get very far before a woman burst out of the bathroom with a gun in her hands and immediately opened fire in their direction. 1 man died in the driveway from gunshot wounds, and at least one of the 2 who fled are thought to have been struck as well. In the security video, the woman's roommate could be seen consoling her and taking the gun from her hands as she stood at the scene trying to process what had just happened. She was staying at the house for work and didn't live there permanently, according to investigators, who deemed the shooting a justified case of self-defense and declined to press criminal charges. However, authorities did decide to hold one of the suspects, Bernard Little, responsible for the fatal outcome of the home invasion. 18 months after the botched burglary, he was charged with a slew of crimes, including felony murder, armed robbery, being a convicted felon in possession of a firearm, and aggravated assault. He was convicted of the charges and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. According to records, he'll see freedom again by the year 2043. Bernard Little already had multiple serious felony convictions on his record before the deadly intrusion. In 1997 alone, he was convicted of kidnapping, 2 counts of possession of a firearm during a crime, 3 counts of carjacking, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and more. And by the time he got caught for his most recent offenses, he'd already served 15 years for previous crimes. Number 3. Shay Lindbergh. Shay Lindbergh was preparing to leave her office in downtown Des Moines in early 2023 when she noticed 2 homeless people, later identified as 56-year-old Lori Potter and 43-year-old Michael Ross, pacing back and forth near her door. She became slightly concerned when she noticed one of the suspects allegedly waving at her young son in an apparent attempt to try getting him to go with them. But Lindbergh wrote off her concerns and concluded that the pair were likely just there to apply for a job. Instead of remaining safely inside her office, however, she decided to leave. After walking out the door, Lindbergh was approached by Potter, who she later accused of grabbing her son and claiming that she was the boy's real mother. Potter allegedly yelled at Lindbergh to give her child back and began running away with the woman's son in her arms. According to a police report, Lindbergh pulled a gun and ordered the 2 suspects to leave the building immediately. Luckily, the pair obeyed her command, and she successfully thwarted the attempted kidnapping of her little boy. In the words of Des Moines police spokesperson Sergeant Paul Parizak, Lindbergh's decision to brandish a weapon had the desired effect, and luckily no actual violence was necessary. Police eventually caught up with Potter and Ross nearby and took them into custody on 1 count each of felony child stealing. This case is recent, though, so they have yet to receive their sentences. Number 2. Joe Howard Teague. Frustrated with repeated home break-ins, a 93-year-old retired plumber named Joe Howard Teague decided to turn the tables on a group of intruders who kicked in his front door one day in early 2022. Armed with a pistol, he confronted the thieves in his Moreno Valley, California home and attempted to put them under citizen's arrest. But they refused to comply with Teague's orders and began throwing things at him, so he called 911 and told the dispatcher that he was holding several suspects amid a burglary in progress at his home. Riverside County deputies arrived to find at least 1 suspect suffering from a gunshot wound. The others, which included at least 1 female suspect, had fled the scene on foot, according to witnesses. Emergency responders rushed the wounded suspect, 33-year-old Joseph A. Ortega, to the hospital in critical condition, while law enforcement took Teague to the station for questioning. After hearing the senior citizen's version of events, detectives decided that the shooting appeared to be justified. Ortega died from his injuries a week after the botched robbery, and in a statement, the sheriff's department reiterated that it had no plans to charge Teague in connection with the shooting. Number 1. Sean Patrick Zuniga. 3 Texas residents were at their northeast El Paso home one morning in early 2023 when an intruder broke in at around 9 a.m. and fired a gun, injuring a dog at the residence. 37-year-old Sean Patrick Zuniga, who lives at the house, responded by pulling his own handgun and returning fire, striking the intruder. He and the other 2 residents, 60-year-old Danny Russell Dennington and 32-year-old Danny Marshall Dennington, gave responding officers a description of the intruder, who fled on foot. The suspect, 29-year-old Bruce Wayne Murphy, was found at a nearby intersection yelling for help and saying he'd been shot. He was taken to a local hospital for treatment, with plans to transport him to the El Paso County Jail on suspicion of burglary of habitation once he was well enough. According to current records, there's nobody by Murphy's name currently being held, suggesting that he's still in the hospital. Either that or he was taken to jail and posted the $500,000 bond the judge set.
13. Boastful driver busts his own windshield. During a motor rally in Key West, Florida in July 2018, a Lamborghini owner decided to show off his $300,000 Aventador to onlookers. He exited the car and stepped on top of the windshield, only to discover the hard way that Lamborghini windshields apparently crack very easily. The glass broke instantly under the man's weight, but he didn't seem to mind. Perhaps he was trying to save face, but he continued posing for several moments before getting back into the car and driving away. A woman riding in the car's passenger seat seemed noticeably upset about the damaged windshield, and one can only imagine that the ensuing conversation between the pair was anything but pleasant. 12. Ferrari race ends in fiery crash. The foolish decision to street race one afternoon in 2023 ended in disaster for two Ferrari owners who were vacationing in Osimo, Italy. The Belgian nationals, aged 50 and 54, both lost control of their car and proceeded to fly off a curb. Their Ferraris became airborne and crashed into the fence of a nearby home at the exact same time. While the men were lucky enough to walk away with only minor injuries, the vehicles experienced a much different fate. One of the Ferraris burst into flames, and the vacationers likely didn't enjoy having to pay for the damages to the cars and the home, not to mention any medical bills they accrued after the collisions. 11. Gun-toting grandma versus armed intruder. 74-year-old Rebby Robertson was at home watching TV in Bowie County, Texas on New Year's Day in 2017 when an armed intruder entered her home. Luckily, though, the senior citizen's .38 caliber pistol was within arm's reach. She grabbed the gun off a nearby table and pointed it at the would-be robber, who took off running. Robertson chased after the man while opening fire in his direction, leaving her wall riddled with bullet holes. The suspect fled the scene, and it was unclear whether he was shot. Speaking with local station KSLA, Robertson openly admitted that she tried to kill the intruder, and she said that she'd do the same if anyone else tried to break into her house. Considering that the incident happened in Texas, police didn't seem to have a problem with the elderly woman's way of handling the situation, which could have had a much worse outcome for both parties. When the story broke, the suspect was still at large, and it's still unclear whether he was identified or captured. 10. Racist rambler gets right hooked. An ignorant strap hanger paid a painful price for his behavior after deciding that the London Underground was an appropriate place to vocalize his racist beliefs one day in 2020. As he rambled incoherently on the train, an onlooker pulled out their phone and hit the record button. Footage showed the raging passenger screaming at someone out of the camera's view and demanding to know the person's name before commenting on their skin color. The woman filming the encounter asked the man about the relevance of the person's skin tone, and he turned his rage toward her, telling her to shut up. In addition to violating the COVID mask mandate that was in place at the time, the irate subway rider was plain old rude. He continued targeting innocent bystanders with derogatory racial comments, including a group of black passengers whom he referred to as pets. One of the group members turned around and delivered a much-deserved right hook to the man's face, and he immediately flew backward across the train car before falling on the floor and being knocked unconscious. One person ran to the man's aid, while a woman could be heard laughing and saying not to help a racist. The outcome of the situation is unclear, but it's likely safe to assume that the man learned a lesson or two about running his mouth. 9. Tables turned for Tennessee thief. A Tennessee resident was just going about his business one day in 2018 when a longtime acquaintance allegedly tried to rob him at gunpoint. The suspect, later identified by police as DeAndre Nolan, likely wasn't expecting the victim to fight back. But he did, and he managed to wrestle Nolan's gun out of his hands. The victim shot his attacker in the leg and then detained him until the police arrived. News reports didn't clarify whether Nolan was charged with any crimes, but at the very least, he likely learned that it's a terrible idea to rob people violently. 8. Entitled squatters are held accountable. After receiving a 911 hang-up call one day in December 2022, deputies responded to a residence in Kissimmee, Florida, where they encountered a couple who were later identified as Martin Gonzalez Garcia and Ashializ Roldan Oscasio. Law enforcement had been searching for the pair, who were suspected of stealing $140 worth of merchandise from a local Dollar General store earlier that day. During the conversation with police, Roldan Oscasio allegedly said that she dialed 911 to ask for help moving the couple's belongings out of the home, where they were squatting illegally. They also planned to ask for a ride to the airport so they could travel to New York State for the weekend. To the suspect's credit, Gonzalez Garcia reportedly admitted to stealing several pairs of earphones, a Bluetooth headset, and a cell phone during the Dollar General robbery. According to police, he said he took the items so he could sell them and make some money. He also allegedly said that he and Roldan Oscasio had broken into the house to get out of the cold for the night. Both suspects were charged with burglary of a residence, while Gonzalez Garcia was hit with additional charges of burglary and theft for the Dollar General robbery. And as you've likely already guessed, they didn't get a ride to the airport. In a Facebook post, the Polk County Sheriff's Office wrote that they were happy to give the couple a lift to the local jail and that they were welcome to stay the entire weekend. 7. Woman wins lottery after paying it forward. Brianna Mills did not expect anything in return when she paid for someone's groceries one afternoon in November 2023. She noticed that the person ahead of her in line at a 7-Eleven store in Virginia was struggling to pay for their items and decided to help out of the kindness of her heart. After covering the fellow customer's bill, she treated herself to a $5 scratch-off ticket, which turned out to be a $150,000 winner. And when she stepped outside, Mills noticed a double rainbow in the sky. She thought it would make the perfect backdrop for a photo of the winning ticket, which she posted on social media while announcing the windfall to her friends and family. Mills didn't say whether she had any specific plans for the money, but she certainly went home feeling like her kindness had helped lead her to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. 6. Angry cyclist takes a spill. 29-year-old Heidi Cooper was accepting a courier delivery outside her home in Yorkshire, England in October 2023 when an Aldi employee approached on a bicycle and asked the delivery person to move out of the way so he could squeeze past. And under his breath, the cyclist muttered something about the delivery man's van being parked illegally. The delivery man fired back with a comment about how it was illegal to ride a bicycle on the sidewalk. By then, the cyclist was riding toward him at full speed in an apparent attempt to scare him. But the gesture failed miserably when the Aldi worker slammed on his brakes to avoid a collision and went flying over the handlebars, hitting his shoulder against Heidi's perimeter wall on the way down. He landed on the pavement and continued talking smack at the delivery driver as he struggled to his feet, saying, "I have more rights than you." At the time, Heidi was so shocked by the cyclist's behavior that she stayed silent, worried that a fight was about to break out and wanting absolutely no part of it. But when she showed surveillance footage of the incident to her partner later on, she got a good laugh out of it and decided to share it on social media. While the delivery man's van was parked illegally, Heidi believed that the cyclist got a well-deserved serving of karma for his attitude. In a TikTok video that quickly garnered over 1 million views, she commended the delivery driver for remaining calm throughout the confrontation. Opinions among commenters varied, with many agreeing with Heidi's assessment that the Aldi employee acted way out of line and that he committed the bigger offense by riding his bike on the sidewalk. Others argued that the delivery driver seemed to think that parking laws didn't apply to him, while expecting the cyclist to respect the rules. 5. Drug dealer's dope delivery lands in the wrong hands. On what began as a normal workday at a restaurant in Auburn, Maine in April 2023, employees opened what they thought was a shipment of mugs and discovered $3 million worth of fentanyl. The plastic tote that the delivery arrived in contained roughly 14 kilos, or 31 pounds of the highly illegal and deadly drug. A staff member contacted the police, who kept an eye on the restaurant to see if anyone came by in search of the illicit package. And sure enough, just an hour after the drugs arrived, a suspect identified by law enforcement as 41-year-old Jeremy Mercier came waltzing into the parking lot in an apparent attempt to retrieve the goods. Mercier, who owns a local motorcycle repair shop, has no connection to the restaurant, according to police, who said that they found a shipping label inside the drug delivery with the suspect's name on it. He was charged with 2 counts of aggravated drug trafficking and 1 count of aggravated importing of drugs. And in case you didn't know, each charge is a felony punishable by a prison sentence of up to 30 years. Records show that Mercier was convicted on a federal cocaine distribution charge in 2007 and served several years in prison. He was allegedly out on bail for an unrelated misdemeanor case during his most recent arrest and is being held at the Androscoggin County Jail on $500,000 bail. In a statement to local station WMTW, the restaurant's owner, Mike Peters, commended his employees for intercepting the fentanyl, especially considering the damage the drug has done to local communities. He also politely asked that people send their drugs somewhere other than his business. 4. Violent predator gets maximum prison time. A young Mississippi woman was out on her regular morning run on June 4, 2021, when a man named Chris Bamberg pulled up in a truck and asked for directions. After the woman gave the information and turned to continue running, Bamberg attacked her from behind and forced her into his truck while repeatedly threatening to kill her. The woman fought back with all her strength, even as Bamberg struck her in the head with his gun. But after spotting duct tape and zip ties in the vehicle, she knew that her attacker had sinister plans for her, and she wasn't about to make it easy for Bamberg to carry out his twisted fantasy. As the assailant tried to zip tie the victim's arms, she bit him repeatedly and was able to escape. She ran home and rushed inside while yelling out to her family for help. The woman's stepfather would later describe how she arrived home covered in so much blood that the only part of her face he could see was the whites of her eyes. Her head was also covered in deep lacerations which required staples. A roll of duct tape was found on the ground nearby, and footage of Bamberg's truck helped investigators identify him as the culprit. The 37-year-old turned himself in the next morning following an all-night manhunt. To the victim's loved ones, there was no doubt that Bamberg intended to kill her. The community was also shaken by the horrific attack, and the authorities were just as determined as anyone to ensure that justice was served. In September 2023, Bamberg pleaded guilty to kidnapping and attempted murder. The judge imposed the maximum sentence of 30 years for the kidnapping charge, plus 33 years for the attempted murder charge, which was calculated specifically to reflect Bamberg's life expectancy. The sentences will run consecutively, putting his projected release date sometime in the year 2086, and ensuring that he'll most likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Throughout the court proceedings, Bamberg's family members said that his violent behavior on the day of the attack didn't reflect the type of person he really was, but they were also apologetic and sympathetic toward the victim, with Bamberg's brother stating that he hoped the sentence would help the woman and her loved ones heal. Bamberg apologized during his sentencing, claiming that he'd found God during the 2 years he spent in custody while the case played out. His attorney, Noah Drake, said that his client pleaded guilty to avoid putting the victim through any more suffering, and that Bamberg took full responsibility for his actions. Considering the emotional trauma that the woman and her family were left with due to his predatory behavior, it was likely hard to believe that he was being sincere. But the ordeal was finally over, and Bamberg is now in a place where he can no longer harm innocent civilians. 3. Fake war hero gets put on blast. Pretending to be a military member or veteran is considered one of the lowest and most disgraceful forms of disrespect in the United States. Many of these fraudsters are mortified at the mere thought of being publicly called out for their impersonating behavior. But most people would likely agree that they deserve to be put on blast. One of the latest phony war heroes to land themselves in the spotlight is a man named Billy Ray Zinnerman, a self-proclaimed retired sergeant major who claimed that he served for the U.S. Marines during Desert Storm and in Afghanistan. According to Arizona-based news outlet In Maricopa, the ruse dates at least as far back as 2010, when he appeared in a PBS special called The Moral Wounds of War. In reality, Zinnerman only served 3 years in the military before being dishonorably discharged in 1980 for frequent misconduct. But his act was apparently convincing enough for him to weasel his way into several veterans organizations. And in 2022, he was the guest of honor at the 247th Marine Corps Ball. During the event, he allegedly told harrowing tales about things that never happened, including a helicopter crash in Afghanistan and being shot in Kuwait. During his public appearance, Zinnerman donned a bulging array of medals, which are now thought to be imitations that were purchased online. The truth about Zinnerman's military service, or in this case, lack thereof, came out in 2023 after some suspicious veterans did some deep digging and discovered that he'd been lying the entire time. According to an In Maricopa expose, Zinnerman claimed that he retired from the Marine Corps in 2002 after serving several tours of duty overseas. But he was reportedly in the United States during all the periods he claimed to be deployed between 1980 and 2002. Furthermore, records show that by 2002, Zinnerman had been arrested for at least a dozen felonies and had been convicted on 4 of the counts. The plethora of medals that he proudly showed off during public appearances are now believed to be replicas that he purchased online. Fact-checkers confirmed with the National Personnel Records Center that there's no record of Zinnerman serving in the military after his discharge in 1980. And there's also an absence of records to show that he received any of the medals he routinely displayed on his uniform. He's since been accused of forging the documents he used as so-called proof of his service. When confronted by a journalist for In Maricopa about the stolen valor accusations, Zinnerman allegedly claimed that he'd recently had a stroke and was experiencing memory problems. The news outlet further reported that Zinnerman had provided some photos that he said were from his military days. But the man in the pictures was identified as an entirely different person who happens to be a real service member. In 2013, the Stolen Valor Act made it a federal crime to profit, attempt to profit, or to receive benefits from false claims of military service. There are rumors that the FBI is investigating Zinnerman, but the agency has refused to comment on the matter when questioned by reporters. In the meantime, Zinnerman has been kicked out of several veterans organizations and is experiencing the added humiliation of others knowing he's nothing but a big liar. 2. Judge throws the book at racist attacker. In a disturbing hate crime that was captured on camera in 2019, a pair of suspects beat an African-American man in a parking lot in Shawnee, Oklahoma. According to police, Devin Nathaniel Johnson and Brandon Wayne Killian allegedly assaulted Jarek Carolina outside a bar where he was innocently enjoying a drink with a friend. Surveillance footage showed one of the perpetrators hurling a racial slur and yelling, "You're dead," while beating the victims. The attackers continued to beat Carolina even after he fell unconscious, and the victim was unable to immediately speak with detectives after being rushed to the hospital due to the severity of his injuries. Johnson and Killian were apprehended shortly after the assault. Federal authorities charged the suspects with hate crimes, and the men were also hit with state-level charges, including aggravated assault and battery. The unprovoked attack left Carolina with numerous injuries, which he may never fully heal from. While recuperating, he told local station KFOR that he didn't remember the beating, and that he was still getting used to all the unforeseen changes that he'd encountered along his road to recovery. Shortly after the attack, authorities announced that they planned for the case to be resolved quickly. But it dragged its heels through the court system for more than 3 years before Johnson and Killian each pleaded guilty to a hate crime in 2022. In doing so, they admitted that they assaulted Carolina due to his race. Months later, in mid-2023, the judge sentenced Johnson to the 10-year maximum for the charge, followed by 3 years of probation. Johnson also pleaded guilty to state-level charges of malicious intimidation or harassment and aggravated assault and battery. He received a 5-year prison sentence, although it's unclear whether he's serving his terms concurrently or consecutively. Records show that Killian is also serving federal time, with a projected release date in 2028. And as an added consequence, he and Johnson are each responsible for paying roughly $68,000 in restitution. 1. Cheating wife concocts false attack story. When 30-year-old Renee Dawn Skoglund decided to step out on her husband with another man during a visit to Florida in 2023, she apparently wasn't thinking about the potential consequences. After the encounter, she began to worry about the possibility of having contracted an STI. But she didn't want to pay for the testing, so she told the police that someone had attacked her and forced themselves on her, enabling her to access the testing for free. Skoglund filed a bogus police report claiming that she'd run into car problems along Interstate 75 in Hillsborough County. According to her initial version of events, an unknown individual approached her while she sat stranded along the roadside and put a towel over her head. The attacker supposedly forced Skoglund into the back seat of her car and bound her hands and feet with rope before carrying out the assault. Since her face had been covered the entire time, Skoglund was unable to describe what the attacker looked like. But investigators quickly discovered that the entire story was a pile of lies. Footage from a local Walmart store showed Skoglund buying the rope that she claimed was used to tie her up. And surveillance video from other locations also conflicted with the story Skoglund had provided to the police. By the time law enforcement decided to make an arrest, Skoglund had returned to her home in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So she was extradited to Florida to face charges for lying to the police. In a statement, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office accused Skoglund of attempting to change her story several times before she admitted she was lying about the attack. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of making a false police report and was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest and 8 years of probation. The judge also ordered her to repay more than $17,000 in costs that were wasted on resources to investigate the bogus claims.
Eliza Slaughter and Eliza Alisfant. In February 2023, police officers in Waterbury, Connecticut got a tip from someone who reported seeing a Hyundai sedan that had been stolen. When law enforcement tried to arrest 2 young women who were in the car, later identified as 18-year-old Eliza Slaughter and 22-year-old Eliza Alisfant, the driver suddenly hit the gas and struck a police cruiser. The women then got out and fled on foot, but were quickly apprehended. Police seized 14.9 grams of cocaine, 25 baggies containing a mixture of heroin and fentanyl, and a loaded ghost gun from them. As a convicted felon, Eliza Alisfant was already banned from having firearms in her possession. So, she and Slaughter were each charged with weapons in a motor vehicle, theft of a motor vehicle, second-degree criminal trover, interfering with an officer, possession of narcotics with intent to sell, and possession of over a ½ ounce of cocaine in freebase form. Alisfant was also charged with 3 additional gun-related counts, while Slaughter faced 2 extra counts of assaulting an officer. In addition to the recent charges, Slaughter was already wanted on a warrant for robbery, larceny, and threatening. A police spokesperson spoke with CT Insider and said that both women were considered suspects in even more incidents involving stolen cars. According to state records, Slaughter is currently behind bars for a pending assault charge. The status of Ali's Vant's legal situation is unclear, but one thing is known: these two women were bad news. 9. Lacey Watson. While working a routine patrol in Ocala, Florida during October 2014, police officer Jeffrey Hall tried to pull over a Lincoln for running past a stop sign. As he sped up and got closer to the car in question, he recognized it as belonging to 19-year-old named Lacey Watson, the girlfriend of a wanted felon in the area named Ison Tion Thomas. At the time, Thomas was actually inside the car with Watson, making the situation more intense. According to law enforcement, the young woman had been questioned regarding Thomas's whereabouts and denied knowing where he was. That clearly was not the case that day. Officer Hall switched his lights on, but instead of pulling over, the driver sped up. After driving through a parking lot and over a few speed bumps at an unsafe speed, the car came to a sudden stop. Thomas then got out of the vehicle and ran into a nearby wooded area. A pair of officers chased after him and quickly arrested him, at which point they realized that Watson had fled the scene with her car. The vehicle was later discovered in an apartment complex parking lot. A drug canine detected something suspicious in the car, giving police probable cause to search through it. They spotted cocaine and a duffel bag holding marijuana. In addition to the battery charge he was already wanted for, Ascension Thomas was charged with cocaine possession, marijuana possession, and resisting arrest. Watson was also arrested for her role and eluding the police. 8. Nishaban Mystery. In December 2022, when 37-year-old Nishaban Mystery hit an elderly pedestrian with supposedly thought she'd just hit a bush. So she continued driving, and the pedestrian passed away from their injuries. By the time Mystery returned to the scene, this time on foot, it was already flooded with emergency responders and police officers. A search of her cell phone revealed that she conducted several incriminating Google searches after the crash, including what happens to hit-and-run drivers who were later found by their license plates, police hit-and-run procedure UK, do most hit-and-run drivers get caught, can you get away with a hit-and-run, and do the police usually find the people behind hit-and-run accidents. These searches indicated that she knew what she'd done and tried to play dumb. Mystery managed to avoid getting any prison time after pleading guilty to failing to stop or report a road accident. She was handed a 17-week suspended jail sentence, was banned from driving for a year, was ordered to perform community service, and also had to attend a rehabilitative program. The sentence seemed shockingly easy to many, considering the severity of Mystery's crime. But she only had a second to react after seeing the pedestrian, according to a police spokesperson, who said that the person who was hit was hidden from view of the road. In other words, there was little to no evidence suggesting that Mystery was driving erratically. Her biggest mistake was her decision to leave the crime scene, and her subsequent Google searches didn't exactly help her case. 7. Ecuadorian grenade gang blows itself up. While carrying out a botched home invasion in La Concordia, Ecuador in September 2023, a gang of 6 disguised criminals opened fire on the property before suddenly fleeing the scene as if they'd been spotted. Security footage from the neighborhood showed the suspects running toward their getaway car as the driver revved up the engine. Just seconds after everyone crammed inside and the group started to drive away, the getaway car erupted into flames. One of the suspects had reportedly pulled the pin on a hand grenade and forgot to throw it away. He instead took it into the car with him. According to some reports, 4 of the men were killed instantly on impact, while the other 2 were seriously injured. Local law enforcement claimed that no injuries had been reported in the area the night of the blast, even after police contacted local medical facilities to see if any of the suspects sought treatment for injuries. Authorities also said that they hadn't received any calls from the homeowner who was targeted in the intrusion. For now, the circumstances surrounding the incident remain unclear, and the suspects' identities and motives for targeting the house also remain a mystery. 6. Lewis Tracy. In October 2022, a group of 4 criminals decided to recruit 22-year-old Lewis Tracy as their 5th member before conducting a home invasion they planned to commit in Birmingham, England. The young man's role was to snap the lock on the front door while his machete-wielding masked accomplices entered the home and did the robbery. The plot was foiled when the intruders realized the targeted family was still home. They quickly reversed course and left the scene in 2 getaway cars. As of 2023, everyone involved except for Lewis Tracy is unidentified. Tracy turned his ankle off before the burglary, but he somehow forgot that he was wearing an ankle monitor for a past crime. Needless to say, police had an easy time tracking his location, while the identities of his co-conspirators have proven more difficult to trace. Tracy soon pleaded guilty to aggravated burglary and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He expressed remorse for his actions, and his defense attorney argued that his client was carrying the weight of the punishment for all 5 intruders, since the others remain at large. 5. Danny Patrick. In 2022, a 35-year-old creep from Britain named Danny Patrick started stalking 4 female victims. He followed the women often in order to find out where they lived, and even began delivering anonymous handwritten letters to their houses. In the letters, Patrick wrote that he was their secret admirer and asked them to text message him with their name and age if they wanted to find out his identity and see what he wanted. He didn't sign his name, but he included his cell phone number, making it easier for police officers to identify him as the primary suspect. The first victim brushed off the first note she received, assuming it had been meant for someone else or that it was just a big prank. She later started to worry when she got another letter 2 days later. This note was much more inappropriate than the first, and her doorbell camera captured footage of Patrick hand-delivering it to her house. At that point, she felt terrified and feared that Patrick would come back and spy on her. She even stopped going outside unless completely necessary. In a note to another one of the victims, Patrick allegedly said that he had had eyes on the woman for quite some time and even described her as sexy. The women who received the disturbing letters started living in fear as they went about their daily lives, and they found themselves changing their usual routines to avoid being spied on. Patrick has a history of these kinds of crimes, according to police, and he also has a history of violating rules surrounding his previous convictions. He pleaded guilty to 4 more charges in connection to his most recent crimes and was handed a 20-month jail sentence, as well as a 10-year restraining order banning him from ever contacting the victims again. 4. Terry Lewis. Over a 3-month period in 2022, a homeless British burglar named Terry Lewis went on a crime spree throughout Cambridge, England, targeting churches, charity shops, and other businesses. Driven mainly by addiction, the 46-year-old took a church collection box, thousands of dollars worth of jewelry, and cash. He even stole hundreds of dollars from a hospice non-profit. Lewis sometimes left crime scenes without taking anything, while leaving many clues behind at the same time, like his birth certificate, prison ID cards, footprints, DNA, and surveillance footage. Described by Crown Prosecutor Ryan Parker as a prolific opportunistic burglar, Lewis eventually pleaded guilty to 5 counts of burglary and 1 count of attempted burglary after getting caught. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail. He also admitted to 9 additional burglaries which were factored into his sentence. 3. Dr. Jacqueline Kotarak. In August 2010, after a night out drinking in Bakersfield, California, a 49-year-old doctor named Jacqueline Kotarak went to her estranged boyfriend's house, William Moody. The man didn't want a confrontation that day, so he slipped out the back door and spent the night somewhere else. Kotarak was reported missing the next day. Knowing she was last seen at Moody's house, police searched the property but found no sign of the missing woman. A few weeks later, the inside of Moody's house started to smell extremely bad. Police were called back to the scene, and this time they located Kotarak. She'd gotten stuck in the chimney flue and passed away while trying to get into her ex's house. After failing to break the back door in with a shovel, she decided to climb up to the roof using a ladder and shimmy down the chimney. Moody told Bakersfield.com that he couldn't imagine Cotterang behaving the way she did unless she was intoxicated. No alcohol or drugs were found in her system, but her body was so decomposed by the time it was spotted that anything she drank that night likely already metabolized. Cotterang had some prescription medication still in her system, but they were all at normal levels. The coroner ruled that she'd suffocated and that her death was a major accident. But it's impossible to know what was going through her mind during her last night alive and what might have caused her to act so strangely. 2. Samuel Walmsley. In October 2021, an Audi with 2 young men inside failed to stop before crashing in Lancashire, England. The occupants, later identified as Samuel Walmsley and Noah Mulligan, then fled the scene on foot. Inside the car, police officers discovered a number of tools that are usually used in burglaries. Walmsley and Mulligan were soon arrested in connection to the crash. Meanwhile, detectives uncovered evidence that the young men and 12 other suspects were part of a gang involved in drug dealing and trafficking, vehicle thefts, and more criminal conspiracies. Some of the most incriminating evidence was seen in the suspects' phones. Walmsley's device held photos and videos of him showing off large wads of cash, which he posted online to Snapchat. He also filmed a fellow gang member in a stolen car and described the successful burglary as a job well done. There were also images of stolen items taken during robberies and videos of gang members breaking into a vehicle. Other suspects' cell phones had similar messages, photos, and videos. In the clips, the young men were seen laughing about their crimes. Altogether, 14 men were convicted on charges relating to their gang activity. They received prison sentences totaling almost 50 years. Walmsley was sentenced to 2 years and 4 months in prison, and he endured the humiliation of having one of his photos turned into a meme. After he was sentenced, the Lancashire police tweeted a side-by-side image of Walmsley during his gang days with a stack of money in his hand and his mugshot. The agency played along with the online attention and captioned the post, "How it started versus how it's going." 1. Kyle Wood. In 2022, while robbing a victim at knife point in Long Eaton, Derbyshire, one night, a man later identified as 34-year-old Kyle Wood made the stupid mistake of yelling his own name out loud. A bystander was trying to step in and help when he shouted, "Do you know who I am?" before loudly declaring his identity in the street for all to hear. It made it easy for law enforcement to track him down as the prime suspect in the robbery, along with a similar incident that happened around the same time. Wood allegedly attacked 2 male victims as they were getting off buses around midnight. He was well known to police, who said he had a history of drug abuse and was known to use cocaine. His violent behavior caused at least one of the robbery victims to be scared for their life. During one of the crimes, a co-defendant later identified as Amy Turner allegedly held the victim's hair and demanded money while Wood held the knife against the victim's back. Turner later denied any involvement in the crimes, but ultimately pleaded guilty to helping with one of the robberies. Wood pleaded guilty to both robberies and 2 knife-related counts. He expressed remorse for what he'd done, but by then he had at least 19 criminal convictions under his belt, leaving one to wonder whether he truly meant the apology. The repeat offender's lawyer claimed that this client committed the robberies during a self-destruct moment in his life, at a time when he stopped taking his prescribed medication for mental illness. But there's simply no excuse for the terror Wood inflicted on innocent civilians, and given his history, the judge concluded that it was appropriate to throw him behind bars. He was sentenced to 3 years and 8 months in prison. Randy Lee Cooper and Kristen Nicole Begu. During the summer of 2020, police officers from Newburgh, Dundee, Oregon had to chase down a Toyota Land Cruiser that had recently been reported stolen. They first spotted the vehicle driving around in the downtown area and pursued it for a few blocks as the driver tried to elude law enforcement. Thankfully, he didn't get very far before he crashed into a Buick Regal, which ironically had also allegedly been stolen. And without even trying to do so, the police were able to kill two birds with one stone, figuratively speaking, of course. The driver of the Land Cruiser, identified by the authorities as 27-year-old Randy Lee Cooper of Portland, was charged with a slew of crimes, including 1 count each of third-degree assault, fleeing or attempting to elude a police officer, reckless driving, and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. Police officers also identified the driver of the Buick, which had been reported stolen 3 weeks prior, as 25-year-old Kristen Nicole Begue. She received her own set of charges, which included driving under the influence of intoxicants and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. Both suspects were released after their arrest, and the outcomes of their cases are now unclear. 7. Sean Crawshaw. In early 2017, an elderly homeowner in Manchester, England, came home from shopping one day and found an intruder stuck inside her bathroom's window. He was perched about 15 feet above the ground and needed help getting down. Emergency responders had to be called in to get the criminal out. 47-year-old Sean Crawshaw was allegedly trying to sneak into the senior citizen's house when he got himself stranded. It took firefighters a whole 20 minutes to free him from his tricky position, which left him with a minor ear injury. The crew didn't hesitate to snap a few pictures of the suspect as they helped him out of the embarrassing predicament. After being rescued by law enforcement, Crawshaw was promptly arrested for the botched burglary. Greater Manchester Police Sergeant Richard Garland was quick to throw a little humour into his interview with the BBC, stating it was nice of him to hang around. On a more serious note though, he said that the homeowner was left shaken by the unwelcome intrusion. Crawshaw pleaded guilty to burglary with the intent to steal and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. 6. Calvin Wilson. In 2001, while renovating the chimney of a historic building in Natchez, Mississippi, a team of brick masons uncovered a fully clothed human skeleton. The remains were obviously unidentifiable to the naked eye, but the deceased person's wallet held pay stubs belonging to a Louisiana man named Calvin Wilson. He'd actually gone missing 15 years earlier, in 1985. Jewelry found on the remains also indicated that the bones most likely belonged to the long-missing man as well. About a year after Wilson vanished at the age of 27, bones were found along the banks of the Mississippi River. Authorities thought they may have belonged to Wilson, and his family had no reason to suspect otherwise. They were shocked by the discovery of his body inside the chimney over a decade later, especially since they thought they'd laid Wilson to rest and said their goodbyes. When the first set of remains was located in 1986, DNA technology was still in its infancy. Genetic testing wasn't widely available, leaving law enforcement to rely on other means of identifying bodies. But the technology had come a long way by the time Wilson's skeleton was discovered, and samples were taken from both sets of bones to be sent for DNA testing. Given the circumstances that Wilson's remains were spotted in, police concluded that he was probably trying to shimmy down the 2-story chimney with plans to rob the building, which housed a gift store at the time of his attempted break-in. He had a long history of burglary, and there aren't many other reasons for trying to sneak into a closed-off building through its chimney. Wilson most likely got stuck inside as the vertical passageway narrowed and was unable to call out for help, leaving him to suffer a slow, lonely death. At the time, the chimney wasn't in use and the flue was completely sealed off, effectively concealing any possible odor of decomposition. 5. Julian Aham Neers. If you're going to give the cops a reason to pull you over, it's probably a good idea to make sure there's nothing illegal in plain sight or in your car, period. This is exactly what 22-year-old Julian Aham Neers was trying to do in 2016, when he allegedly ate his whole weed supply to avoid getting caught with it during a traffic stop that took place in New Braunfels, Texas. The young man was handed several traffic citations for having a broken headlight and license plate light, and was arrested for a speeding warrant. While interacting with Aham Neers, the police officer noticed a strange smell of marijuana on his breath. He asked Julian to open his mouth wide and immediately noticed scraps of marijuana leaves on his teeth and tongue, which was tinted slightly green. It was enough probable cause to search through Homeowner's vehicle, but the officer only discovered a few tiny crumbs of weed, along with a cup that looked like it had been used as an ashtray at some point. There wasn't enough pot at the scene to charge Homeowner with possession, and the arresting officer had a hunch why. Homeowner was hit with one felony count of tampering with or fabricating evidence for allegedly consuming his weed, along with the speeding warrant he was wanted on and the traffic citations he received that day. He was eventually released on $7,000 bond, pending the outcome of the case. Sadly, news outlets failed to follow up on the case, but Julian's name hasn't reappeared in any major news articles since this incident, which suggests that he dealt with his legal issues and put the situation behind him. 4. Juanita Marie Jones. In August 2007, 53-year-old Juanita Marie Jones was disappointed after discovering that she paid $20 for a fake crack rock from an unnamed drug dealer in Rochelle, Georgia. She knew she'd been ripped off when she didn't feel high after breaking the rock up into 3 tiny pieces and smoking one of them. Typically, when you buy a faulty product from a store, you can return it, and in some cases you can even sue or file criminal charges against whoever sold you the broken item. But this isn't exactly how things work when it comes to illegal goods like street drugs. Jones nevertheless called the police and said she wanted help getting her money back after buying the fake crack. She even showed the drugs to a deputy and an officer who paid her a visit, and while the crack may not have been up to her high standards, it was plenty real enough for law enforcement to arrest her on suspicion of drug possession. The outcome of the case is currently unclear, but it wasn't a very serious charge in the first place. It's probably safe to assume that Jones squared away her legal matters and moved on with her life. One can only hope that she found some healthier, legal hobbies. 3. Fleeing bank robber stops to buy smokes. A high-speed police chase isn't really the type of situation where you can hit the pause button and go take care of another errand. But that's just what one Phoenix man tried to do after robbing a bank in July 2007. According to police officers, the suspect went into a Bank of America branch at around 10 o'clock a.m. and quietly handed a demand note to a teller. He left with an undisclosed amount of cash in his pockets and was seen getting into a pickup truck. An employee wrote down the license plate number on the vehicle, and investigators were able to launch a stakeout near the man's residence. Law enforcement tried to corner the suspect as he left his home with a woman, but the pair managed to get into the white pickup truck before officers could grab them. The driver then shifted the truck into reverse and backed straight into an unmarked police cruiser before driving away quickly. A chase then began for the next few minutes before the male suspect dropped the woman back off at the property they'd just left. By then, the police had a helicopter up in the air, tracking the man's every movement. As he continued to elude authorities, the accused bank robber pulled into a convenience store parking lot and went into the business with a $20 bill. He handed the money over to the cashier and demanded a pack of cigarettes in return. The suspect even asked for his change and waited several moments before seeing a police car outside and leaving the store without the money he was owed. By then, law enforcement was gaining on him, and the pursuit lasted for only a few more minutes before the man ran over some stop sticks the police placed in the road to pop his tires. He was then taken into custody on suspicion of bank robbery and multiple other crimes, but his identity was never publicly revealed, and the outcome of the case is still a mystery. 2. Christian Barla. In 2000, a Polish small business owner named Dariusz Januszewski was discovered dead in a lake in the city of Wrocław after being reported missing 4 weeks before. His hands were tied up behind his back, and he seemed to have been tied up in an extremely uncomfortable backward cradle position, which gets tighter as the person pulls on the ropes to free themselves. Januszewski's body showed signs of torture and starvation, and a medical examiner concluded that he'd most likely drowned after being thrown into the water. The case went unsolved for 3 years as law enforcement poured countless amounts of time, manpower, and resources into the investigation. Their first big break came from an unexpected source years later in 2003, when Polish author Christian Barla published a book called Amok. The story is about an unsolved murder that had suspicious similarities to the circumstances surrounding Januszewski's death. It caught the attention of a cold case detective named Jack Robluski, who brought new attention to the case. Robluski read Barla's novel multiple times, only becoming more certain with each repetition that the author was responsible for Januszewski's death. The evidence against Barla only grew as the investigation unfolded. Investigators realized that Barla called Januszewski the day he went missing and later sold the victim's cell phone online. They also learned that Barla suspected that his estranged wife and Januszewski were having an affair. In fact, Januszewski seemed to have a lot of things Barla wanted. He was a successful businessman who ran a small advertising agency, while Barla struggled just to make ends meet and lacked any business savvy whatsoever. Barla even filed for bankruptcy the same year Januszewski was murdered, by which point his marriage was in ruins. Prosecutors soon accused Barla of kidnapping Januszewski from his office and killing the victim out of jealousy. They claimed that the suspect confessed to the murder during questioning, but that he later took back his statement. Barla argued in court that his confession was forced out of him. He denied involvement in the crime and claimed that he wrote Amok based on information he learned from news articles. But the novel had details only Januszewski's killer would have known at the time, so this explanation didn't make sense. It also held other uncanny similarities that were impossible to ignore. Much like Januszewski, the murder victim in the novel owned a small advertising agency. He was also bound and tortured before being thrown into a body of water. In 2007, Barla was found guilty of planning and directing Januszewski's murder, but the court ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to fully convict him of carrying out the crime. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but won a retrial the next year. Barla was once again found guilty of masterminding the murder and was ordered to keep serving his original 25-year sentence. 1. Poison Umbrella Plot. Nicknamed Dr. Death, Dr. Wouter Basson led a chemical and biological weapons program that mainly targeted South Africa's black population during the country's apartheid era. In 2000, he went on trial for criminal allegations stemming from his past. Specifically, Basson was accused of giving lethal drugs to people who killed hundreds of prisoners of war during the 1980s. During the trial, a witness named Trevor Floyd described a plot to kill exiled anti-apartheid officials from the African National Congress Party, who lived in London back in 1986 and 1987. The plan apparently called for the assassination of South African Member of Parliament Pallo Jordan and the country's Minister of Water Affairs and Forestry, Ronnie Kasrils. According to Floyd, a former member of the now-defunct Civil Cooperation Bureau's death squad, the weapon for carrying out the hits would have been an umbrella that shoots poison darts. To stop the device from being traced to South Africa, Floyd got an umbrella from Europe and traveled to England to pick it up after it had been modified into a lethal weapon. The poison was allegedly provided by Dr. Basson. There were a few problems with the umbrella. While showing Floyd how to use it, a CCB member got some poison on his finger. Floyd told the court during Basson's trial that he thought the man was going to die, but that he felt fine after just 10 minutes. While traveling with the umbrella, Floyd noticed it was very long and prone to tapping the ground, prematurely shooting its poison darts. Floyd then discovered that one of the two intended victims had moved out of London, while the other was never home. The assassination plot was then abandoned and the weapon was discarded into the Thames River. It's definitely a good thing that the killings were never conducted, and the problematic nature of the plan from day one proved that the idea was not nearly as sophisticated as its masterminds hoped it would be. Thanks for watching. Would you rather come home and find an intruder taking a nap on your couch, or be pulled over and screamed at by police officers during a case of mistaken identity? Let us know in the comments below.